their goodbyes.
Home sweet home now. Watching it on telly.
And come they did.
Saw that at Hyde Park.
Bicycles abandoned as the procession passed. The Queen's way strewn with flowers. In Windsor's great park, so beloved of the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, the procession reassembled. A long walk of pageantry, not just fit for a queen, fit for this queen. Waiting for her coffin at the castle, her adored corgis Lick and Sandy, and her fell pony Emma, who she rode into her 90s. You have to imagine the Queen would have smiled at that. In through the gates of Windsor Castle, and on to St George's Chapel, where the Queen last year mourned her husband, sitting alone. The chapel today filled with family and members of her household, past and present. Memories of the late Duke threaded through the music. This Kentuckian of the departed was played at his funeral too.
We give special thanks for the life of thy daughter Elizabeth, for the mercy she received from thee, and for the example that through her life of service, love, and faith, she has set before our eyes.
The orb and sceptre removed from the coffin and placed on the altar, the sovereign's power symbolically relinquished. Without the imperial state crown, the coffin looking suddenly bare. The breaking of the Lord Chamberlain's wand, the end of his service to the Queen. At this, the end of her service to us.
It hath pleased Almighty God to take out of this transitory life unto his divine mercy the late, most high, most mighty, and most excellent monarch, Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of her other realms and territories, Queen.
The Queen's coffin lowered into the royal vault to be reunited with her late husband. Her promise kept, her duty done. The burden of kingship now falling on her grieving son. Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
Poor Charles.
As I'm almost a cruise ship, I mean, one almost runs out of words. A state occasion, but very much a family at the heart of it. And we saw the face of the king there, grief-stricken, exhausted. This is a family too, isn't it?
Yeah, do you know, Mary, today was all about goodbyes. There were like goodbyes from presidents and prime ministers. There were goodbyes from the crowds who were both in London and here. Goodbyes from the military. Remember, it's her military saying goodbye to their commander-in-chief. And also what struck me was just goodbyes from those who'd worked really closely with her. We saw one of her footmen walking along, not only in London but also here in Windsor, walking and walking and walking. These were very long processions today, but I don't think anyone will complain for a second that tonight this family is having a very private moment behind those castle walls in there, inside St George's Chapel, in fact in the very corner of St George's Chapel, where the late Queen is being laid to rest with her late husband, but also in the same place where her mother and father are. No cameras, no one to comment on their grief, no one to share the grief with them, because this is their own very private moment. And I think at the end of the day, we should remember that, and as we go into the following week, and there's royal mourning, which will last for another 7 days, we have to think about them. But you're right to say that, when we were looking at the King and everything he's been through this week, both saying goodbye, but also cementing his role as a new king, I don't think anyone will be able to forgive him for what's etched on his face. And it was, I think, people's hearts will go out to him and everything that he's been through.
Absolutely, he's lost his mind after all, hasn't he? Chris, for the moment, thank you. Well, tens of thousands of people played their part in today's extraordinary event, patiently waiting in Westminster and Windsor and lining the route taken by the state hearse. Many in the huge crowds had stood for hours or even made makeshift camps overnight, despite the cold. Some applauded, some bowed their heads, some cried, but all were determined to pay their respects and say one last goodbye. Now Vincent heard from something.
At the start of a day the like of which few have seen, a famous thoroughfare made ready. At the edges, those with duty still to do, sometimes lit with gold, but waiting behind the barriers, the people.
Tired, very, very tired. No sleep.
No sleep.
No sleep, no. But worth it, isn't it? Can't miss it, can we?
Show me where you slept.
There, that's my bed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I've seen worse.
Oh, yeah, so this is 5-star then.
Let's see, we have Telford to come down to us in Hertford. We brought him in and he's literally just gone to sleep.
He's been awake all night.
Awake all night. He's literally just gone.
I've actually got my grandson's jacket on. He's 6 feet tall, I'm about 5'2". But it's very thick and it's covered all up the ear.
There were hours of anticipation, and then through the air, came the sound of beautiful voices, the start of the funeral service, broadcast in its entirety, and the 2-minute silence that started inside the Abbey, spread all the way along the road up to the palace.
It was beautiful. I loved it.
Felt like you were part of it out here.
Yeah, I do. I did. It's really lovely. It was a lovely, lovely music, lovely service. It's wonderful.
When the procession began, phones were hoisted high in the air, and railings and lampposts and ladders were climbed. What can you see?
I can see loads of shoulders. I can see the Queen's carriage.
What do you think of all the bands?
I think it's really good and I can't wait to see the Queen.
It really was extraordinary, very moving, uplifting, and an extraordinary thing to witness, I think. It really was, yeah.
It was the last hurrah for Her Majesty.
Out in London's greener suburbs, the crowd still came to see the cortege through with stories of a long reign.
It brings all the memories back from Nairobi, where I was born, and my mother in 1952 went and waved at the Queen, young Queen.
And then at Windsor, the last long walk, where the people are very close to Journey's End.
It's just nice to be here at the end, really. I've watched it all the way down from Balmoral on the TV, and I've been to London a few times, so I'm just glad to be here.
The crowd packed into the spaces leading up to the castle. She was a queen they loved, And as dusk fell at the end of this day, they had seen her all the way home. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
We saw some of the biggest crowds lining the routes through central London and also here in Windsor. Neil Connery is in the Mall and Rebecca Barry is in Windsor Forest. Let's turn to you first of all, Neil. Thousands clearly wanted to be part of today's events, didn't they?
Huge crowds here, Mary, determined to show their gratitude, to pay their respects and to be a part of history. As we were hearing there, many people taking pictures and videos, some had their heads bowed, others were in tears. And what really struck me today was when the gun carriage carrying Her Late Majesty made its way along the Mall, the way the applause travelled either side of it. And when it passed Buckingham Palace, I think many in the crowd here, and I suspect at home, were reflecting on all those occasions over the years when we saw Queen Elizabeth on the balcony of the palace during happier occasions like weddings and jubilees. And yet here today was the very last time. Members of the royal household made their way to the front of the palace to pay their respects. It was a very, very moving experience to watch. And one woman I was talking to in the crowd here today just said to me simply, "We have been blessed."
Those images of the long walk here in Windsor really were remarkable. Centuries from now, they'll illustrate to future generations just how the British public mourned and marked the end of the Second Elizabethan age. As we saw the royal standard raised here above Windsor Castle, signalling that the new sovereign was on the estate, I witnessed the raw emotion of people here as they said goodbye to our last monarch and welcomed the next, as the coffin rolled past St George's Gate just up from here, followed by the King, the sound of the drums marking the slow footsteps. I was standing with members of the royal household as they fell silent. Some members of the catering staff bowed their heads, some wiped away tears. Even the police officer on duty gave a salute, then began to cry. High-ranking or not, this has affected so many echelons of British society.
Rebecca Barry in Windsor and Neil Connery in the Mall. Thank you. Well, tributes were paid right across the UK. Many gathered in front of giant TV screens showing the day's events. Pubs up and down the country also fell quiet as the funeral service was shown. Others watched it with friends and family at home, as Rachel Younger reports.
Whether watching through the rain in city squares, or paying tribute to the Queen from sun-filled stadiums, in every corner of the kingdom she loved, they came to say goodbye. And though you cannot stop time, today a country tried. On the Mersey, busy pubs fell cathedral quiet, heads bowed and glasses raised. It wasn't only the abbeys in Windsor and Westminster that saw ceremony today, and particularly for those who'd served, that mattered.
You could see the whole world come together, and again, even though we didn't manage to go down there and be a part of that in London, you still felt a part of it even though it wasn't actually there.
To watch it and like to be with families or not on your own, it's all quite sad. You just want to be with other people.
In Middlesbrough, a steelmaking town fell silent for its sovereign. Children who just 3 months ago rejoiced at her jubilee now pin-drop silent. The polished pageantry of the capital a world away, but there's the same respect in every thoughtful gesture here for a woman whose face was as familiar as family.
As a mum, just, it hits home, doesn't it, when you lose somebody really close.
She definitely connected with people all over. I've not realised how much a connection was until sort of she's passed away, really.
Outside, a hastily arranged bank holiday saw some streets fall completely still. Schools suspended, shops shut, and seafront silent. Hard not to think of lockdown and the late Queen's reassurance that we will meet again. But it's hard to believe there will ever be anyone who brings us together like she did. The same generation that crowded around newfangled televisions to cheer her coronation, gathering again to say an almost impossible goodbye. This final chapter, not an easy one to watch, but even here, amongst the sorrow, there were smiles.
It was very, very good. And I wouldn't have liked to have missed it, but I've seen it now. I loved it. I enjoyed it.
Fantastic. I really, really enjoyed it. Been watching it all the time.
And that's how we tried to take her death in, sticking close on our sofas, remembering together.
She bridged the gaps where other politicians couldn't, didn't she? She got people together.
You got to love her, and it permeates in you to think about her and with her families, and how everyone cares about her, for she cares about people.
One country, 10 days to say goodbye, to understand our Queen is gone, but not the ties that bind us. Rachel Younger, ITV News.
Let's get more from across the home nations now. Our Scotland correspondent Peter Smith is in Edinburgh, Tracy McGee is in Belfast, and Rhys Williams is in Cardiff. Returning to you first, Peter, how did people where you are pay tribute?
It was a much quieter, very sombre affair today compared to the scenes we saw exactly a week ago where the Queen's coffin left the Palace of Holyrood House just behind here and travelled up the Royal Mile to lie at rest in St Giles Cathedral. At that point there were thousands of people on the streets that followed her journey from Balmoral to here. Today we're talking about hundreds, not thousands, who were in Holyrood Park to watch this on a big screen. There was a lone piper on Royal Yacht Britannia. I don't think we should read too much into this, the lack of numbers on the streets. People were content to pay quiet respect at home and watch the service at home. Scotland has already played its part, and it will forever be written in history as the place that the second Elizabethan age came to an end. The people here had had their chance to say goodbye, and today was an opportunity to remember that this is the place the Queen had drawn so many happy days from, and the people had given her so much life.
Across Northern Ireland, people gathered in church and community halls to watch the funeral service, or at big screen events such as the one here at Belfast City Hall. They came from all walks of life, from all ages. Now it has to be said, in the nationalist community there was not the same feeling of loss and grief, but most people here speak of their respect for a leader who tried to build bridges. And those efforts were rewarded today with the sight of the leaders of the political parties at Stormont, so far unable to sit together in government, but willing to sit alongside one another in Westminster Abbey. Among them, Sinn Féin's leader here and First Minister in waiting, Michelle O'Neill. 10 years ago, no one could have imagined such a scene. Today, due to her genuine efforts to build peace, Queen Elizabeth has made the impossible possible.
Well, just 3 days ago, thousands of people lined the streets here in Llandaff, north of Cardiff, hoping to see Charles III on his first ever visit to Wales as King. He attended a service of prayer and reflection at the cathedral here behind me before coming up to meet many people on the green. A very different atmosphere here today, similar to what Peter was saying in Scotland. Eerily quiet here in Llandaff. Clearly many people taking the opportunity for some quiet reflection at home. Unlike in other parts of the UK, there were no big screens in any town or city centre in Wales, but many people came together in cinemas, in pubs, in community centres, in churches and chapels. Many of them opened their doors across the country, giving people an opportunity to come together to mourn Queen Elizabeth II.
Rhys Williams, Tracy McGee and Peter Smith, thank you. Events here, and before we do move on, I'm going to draw your attention to this amazing sunset behind me. Look at the colour of the setting sun on the stones of Windsor Castle there. Magnificent.
Beautiful.
So both here and in Westminster, where the pictures were broadcast across the world to an audience of tens of millions, perhaps even billions, all witnessed a stunning display of pageantry as a nation said a sombre farewell. Emma Murphy now on how the world watched.
Her monarchy stretched far beyond British shores, so too the pageantry to mark the passing of the Elizabethan era. In Canada, one of the Queen's 15 realms, a service of national commemoration to honour her contribution to the nation. The Queen was the most travelled monarch in history and had visited Canada on 22 occasions. As her funeral drew to a close in Windsor, a 96-gun salute marked every year of her life. In Kenya, where her reign began and the world saw the first pictures of Queen Elizabeth, they watched the images marking the end of her reign, remembering how a young princess became a monarch in their country. In Hong Kong, those who couldn't be part of the London service gathered at the British consulate.
I remember I was at Princess Diana's funeral, I was at the Queen Mother's funeral, and to feel that level of grief and loss, but not to be able to be part of it, makes it harder.
In Australia, where she visited 16 times, her image was cast onto the Sydney Opera House. In the United States, some gathered at dawn to be part of a moment of global significance.
She was such an icon of leadership, of self-sacrifice to her country and people, and a great inspiration.
She seemed to be a person steady and committed, regardless of the forces of life that really come upon us. She just seemed to really be a rock of a human being, someone who held steady.
In Nepal, prayers were said for a monarch who visited the country twice, as candles burned at a shrine to honour the late Queen. In Malta, where the Queen made her first state visit and her last, a gun salute marked her memory as a much-travelled monarch made her final journey. Emma Murphy, ITV News.
And our correspondent Dan Rivers is in Sydney tonight. Dan, I chatted to teams and teams of Australian journalists outside the Abbey today. All of them had been broadcasting all night, of course. How have Australians reacted to today's events?
Well, I think most Australians have been viewing the amazing pictures here, which have been broadcast through the evening here, with a mixture of sadness and affection for the Queen. Of course, there's no physical place for them to go and watch anything here, so this was largely a TV event for many people here. And talking to one of the executives of the networks here, they said that internet traffic during the broadcast here in the evening dropped off very low indeed, suggesting most people were tuning in to watch this television broadcast, which has been carried on all of the main networks here. The viewing figures are likely to be among the largest in Australian television history. We'll get those numbers by the morning. It will, of course, be now a moment that Australia starts to look to the future. This last 10 days has really quelled the Republican debate here as everyone pays respects to the Queen, and that tone has been set by the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Looking forward, though, now there may be questions about where Australia goes from here. He's already ruled out any idea of having a referendum on a republic in the next 3 years or so. I think most Australian people will have their own memories. The Queen came here 11 times over 57 years, and everyone will be reflecting on their own memories of her coming to Australia. One thing that struck me talking to someone watching in a pub last night, he said he thought after all of this coverage that support for the monarchy would actually grow.
Dan Rivers in Sydney, thank you. Well, here there was exceptionally tight security today as world leaders attended the funeral. It was the Met Police's biggest ever operation, but there were diplomatic concerns too, as our global security editor Rohit Kachru reports.
Never before this morning had so many British police officers been brought together
for one event. And through the silence, the sound of the drum beats approached. And this enormous operation, codenamed London Bridge, reached its most frenetic moments. No pressure, come on. Among the mourners were kings and queens and presidents and prime ministers and people from everywhere in their hundreds of thousands. President Biden arrived with special permission to use his armoured limousine, nicknamed the Beast. And then the buses. Most leaders were told to give up their diplomatic cars to use this unfamiliar form of transport. Of course, these are leaders who normally hold discussions around conference tables. Today they meet on a bus, wearing black. Like at all funerals, some of the guests have history. Britain's friends and acquaintances came, from democracies to dictatorships to everything in between. Whatever their title, the grandeur of the day, of the moment silenced all, politics could wait for now. China sent its vice president. Pleasantries, but little connection. And he sat far from the American president, tucked in, down the aisle, on row 14, the Polish leader in front of him, the Czech leader behind. No wonder she has become known by some as the Queen of the World. That's down in part to the history of a one-time imperial monarch, but it's down to her too. And her book of condolence drew signatures from leaders everywhere.
It's a loss not only to the royal family, it's a loss not only the UK, it's a loss to all of us, both in the Commonwealth and outside.
There's a world of pressing global issues which they might have discussed under different circumstances. But tonight the normal rules of international diplomacy resume without a unique figure. Rohit Kachru, ITV News, Westminster Abbey.
Members of the public were also invited to be among the mourners inside the Abbey today. They included a father of two who gave out free meals during the pandemic and a brave anti-knife campaigner who'd been attacked whilst pregnant. Also, there was Johnson B. Harry, who became the first living soldier in nearly 50 years to receive the Victoria Cross for his own selfless acts of bravery. Ben Chapman heard from some of the Queen's heroes.
At the heart of this funeral was the Queen's lifetime of service. Fitting then that in the congregation was a privileged few hundred whom she'd recognised for theirs. Among them, Johnson B. Harry, whom the Queen awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for bravery, following his service in Iraq.
It's the first time I shed a tear. It really sinks in when I hear the national anthem and I have to sing it. Because for almost 22 years, I've been singing the national anthem we know, and now the world's changed, and that's when I'm really feeling.
He wore his medal for only the 4th time today, but the service took him back to the day he received it.
It was the scariest day of my life, and she said to me, "You're a very special person. I don't get to do this very often." And then the light bulb came on and I realized I'm in front of Her Majesty. But I remember how easy it was to communicate with her, and I took that in with me.
Commitment to community as well as country was also recognised with invitations. Pranav and Natalie both received MBEs in the Queen's last birthday honours list. Pranav's for his volunteering work during the pandemic.
Seeing the coffin as up close as I did really brought home the fact that our Queen is no longer. And quite honestly, it was at that point I had a lump in my throat, and actually it brought back feelings of other funerals I've been to, including my own grandfather's funeral.
For Natalie, who's campaigned against knife crime, it was a surreal experience.
You've got President Biden going past, and you've got former prime ministers, and then obviously the royal family, and you're thinking, but I'm just Natalie from Birmingham, but I'm still part of this. But I think that's a real testament to the Queen.
Was there a particular moment which really moved you?
I think it was seeing King Charles and seeing the rest of the royal family, and you could really feel that emotion, and I think that really sort of got you inside, because you can think they're saying goodbye to their mother, their grandmother, and that moment will always stay with me.
They are images that many of us will long remember, but those who witnessed them in person are unlikely ever to forget. Ben Chapman, ITV News.
Another of those heroes playing a part in the state funeral today was health worker May Parsons, who delivered the world's first COVID-19 vaccine. She met the Queen and she accepted the George Cross on behalf of NHS England in July, and I'm delighted to say that May joins me now. May, thank you for your time this evening. What did it mean to take part in today's extraordinary events?
It meant the world, and obviously with the Queen being herself and a staunch supporter of the NHS and what it stands for, it's such an honour and a privilege to kind of represent all of NHS England with me today to say our farewell and pay our respects to our Queen. So it's a very surreal, sombre, sad day, but also an opportunity to reflect on what our Queen has done for us.
The Queen was very vocal, wasn't she, during COVID, and we all remember that wonderful speech she made saying that we will meet again. What did that mean to you and your NHS England colleagues at that time?
That was a really difficult moment for us, as you know, challenging, not just for the NHS workers and health workers, but for all of us. And I think coming from the Queen, it's kind of given us, we look up to her for strength and for the service that she's shown us, and it's role modeling what true service looks like, and it kind of resonates with the service that we do in our communities. So the Queen has shown us the way, or led the way, in terms of recognising that we will get through the challenges that we were having, and that there is hope. And I think that is what ultimately she's given a lot of us on that day, and it meant tremendously a lot.
May, I can see you're still very emotional. It was obviously a hugely moving day. You met the Queen, didn't you? You accepted the George Cross. What did she say to you? What was it like?
She was so welcoming, and she was so warm and funny. Her sense of humour that day was still on point, considering, and she made us so welcome in her home. And I think, the saying that they say to you, that the person that made you feel the way that they did is something that you would remember rather than the words that they said. And that is what the Queen has done for me. She's, welcomed me in her home, presented me with the George Cross for all of the NHS staff in England, and that was something that obviously we were really, really grateful for. And yeah, it was a surreal moment, and obviously such a nice moment. No, absolutely not. No, I don't think so. Neither today.
I'll let you go now. It's been a big day. May Parsons, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Well, family was at the very heart of today's events, which saw Prince George and Princess Charlotte play a prominent role. George, who's 9, and 7-year-old Charlotte were the youngest mourners in Westminster Abbey. Watched by the world, they helped escort their great-grandmother's coffin through the Abbey and also at Windsor. And as Chloe Keedy reports, the young royals showed the future of the monarchy is in pretty safe hands.
The frown on his face suggested that young Prince George understood that this would be a difficult day. He and his sister Charlotte are grieving for their great-grandmother, but they're also learning what it means to live these private moments in a very public way. As Westminster Abbey's bell tolled, 9-year-old George glanced up and seemed for a moment to be taking in the enormity of it all. And it is difficult to imagine a more daunting duty than the one that lay ahead. Walking behind the Queen's coffin, next to his father, and watched by the world.
They might have felt a bit nervous, also extra upsetting because they had to go in front of the crowd when their great nans just died. So I think that is important that kids are involved in the royal family, because some people, they don't even know there were any, they just thought, oh yeah, the Queen. I'm proud of them because they're carrying on with life, and they're not letting anything stop them from carrying on.
And that is something these children will have to get used to. The Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations gave us, and them, a glimpse of what the future will be. Of course, they also had lots of personal memories of the great-grandmother they called Gan Gan. Princess Charlotte wore a brooch that was given to her by the Queen as she and her brother took their places on this most historic of days.
You know, this is a message about the continuity of the monarchy and the future, and the fact that these people, at least Prince George, at some point is going to inherit.
But more than the future, today was about the past. And for these two children, it was about saying goodbye to the great-grandmother they loved. Chloe Keedy, ITV News.
Back with our rollers as Chris Shipman, just looking at a 7 and a 9-year-old. Remarkable.
Well, you know, exemplary behaviour for people so young. But I was talking. Well, listen.